Welcome to today's meeting of the Scrutiny Commission. As usual, this meeting is being broadcast live to the public. For those who are not able to watch live, the webcast will be recorded and made available for viewing on the County Council's website after this meeting. Before we begin, can I remind everyone to please turn on their microphone only when you wish to speak or are invited to speak. And it moves us on to item 1, which is the appointment of the chairman. Members are asked to note that I've been appointed chairman of the Scrutiny Commission in accordance with Article 6.05 of the County Council's Constitution. Item 2, which is the election of vice chairman. Can I ask for nominations to the position of vice chairman?
I'd like to propose Mrs. Page as vice chair, please.
Thank you. And is everyone in favour of? Yep. Moves on to item 3 in the minutes within the agenda, which is the minutes from the last meeting held on the 12th of April, which are in pages 5 to 10. I move these are taken as read, confirmed and signed. Is that agreed? Yep. Okay, which moves on to item 4, which is public question time. I've not been advised of any questions from the public. So item 5 is questions asked by members under Standing Order 7. We've not received any such questions. Item 6 is I have no urgent items. Item 7 is declarations of interest. Do any members have any members they wish? Oh, right. Okay. So if there's no declarations, we'll move on to item 8, which is declarations of the party whip. Do any members wish to declare party whip? No. Okay. Item 9, I've not received any petitions. So it therefore moves us on to the first substantive item, which is item 10, which is the report of the Scrutiny Review Panel on Shire Community Grants and Shire Environmental Grant Schemes. Mr. Smith, Chair of the Review Panel, is here to present the report. Welcome, Mr. Smith, and please present your report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning, everyone. So the MTFS 23-24 to 26-27 proposal to cease delivery of the Shire Community and Environmental Grant Programmes with immediate effect was questioned at the Scrutiny Commission held on the 30th of January 2023. The Commissioners appointed a Scrutiny Review Panel of 5 members to review the Shire Community Grants and the Shire Environmental Grant Schemes. The aim of the review was to determine the impacts and value for money achieved through both grant programmes, to examine the profile of past and current recipients and key metrics. This was to include outputs, outcomes, and the value of the awards, and to consider the potential impact of discontinuation of both the grant programmes. In addition, the value of the current programmes and the target operating model. During our meetings, we received an overview of both grant programmes and feedback on how the programme supported the achievement of departmental strategic objectives. We spent a lot of time talking to voluntary community and social enterprise organisations who told us about the impacts and outcomes achieved via the Shire grant funding. We also spoke to other organisations who also provided funding and investment into the BCSE sector. These organisations provided us with an insight into their own grant schemes and offered us their take on the value for money of grant programmes and what investment into the local sector can be achieved for individuals and communities. We really welcomed the contributions from all external witnesses. They were all knowledgeable and enthusiastic. They impressed us with the differences they aim to make through their organisations to individuals, community groups and the environment. However, over the course of the review, we became concerned about the sustainability of the organisations who were awarded Shire grant funding, in particular those who have been awarded with repeat funding. We also had concerns that funding is being provided to organisations like town and parish councils and larger voluntary sector organisations who can employ staff. Throughout the review, we highlighted the importance of the council's financial position and the need for this to remain a key consideration when determining the future for both the grant programmes. The majority of the panel's members felt that we needed to prioritise funding for our core commitments, such as children's and adult social care. As outlined in the report, the decision of the panel by majority was to support the option to operate the grants during the 23-24 financial year with reduced budgets, and cease the grants by the end of the 23-24 financial year to enable sufficient notice to be given to beneficiaries and partners so they can make alternative arrangements. The majority of the panel also supported the change to the criteria for awarding the Shire community grants during the 23-24 financial year to provide grants only to small voluntary and community groups. We agreed that the County Council should continue to provide advice, guidance and signposting to voluntary organisations requiring funding. I therefore present this report to the Commission today and welcome all comments as the report is being presented to Cabinet consideration on the 23rd of June. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Do we have questions or comments on this from members? Mrs. Happy.
Thank you, Chair. Would it be possible for you to sort of expand on some of the outcomes that the Shire grants have been supporting over a previous year? And in the report, I noted there was a concern about repeat grants, and that wasn't seen from the funders. Something like Awards for All, you can apply once every 12 months. So that is something that can happen. So what was the panel's ultimate concern about repeat awards, and was there something specific?
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so if you look on paragraph number 12 in the report, you can see all the different organisations, and from the names of them, you can pretty much gather what they're trying to achieve throughout the community. But several of these organisations have come back for repeat funding year upon year, and at £10,000 a time. Now, the funding is not used for the same things. The funding is used for different things. So to use an analogy, one year that you'd apply for funding for chairs, the following year you'd apply for tables, and so on and so on. And this was something that was highlighted throughout the panel's meetings, that several of these organisations were coming back year upon year for funding. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, just whether or not you could expand on the outcomes, and is that what people were coming back for in terms of repeat funding? Because I did look at the pre-report, which was with regards to advice and support for CABs in a more localised manner for specific groups. So were those the kind of things that were coming back, or was it for equipment?
It was for a broad range of things. So it wasn't just for obviously capital projects and things like that. It was also for funding for staffing, funding for different projects, new branches of those as well. But unfortunately, obviously, we are not a charity organisation, and part of the remit of the whole scope of the panel was to determine whether we can afford to go this and carry it on. So if when you look at these constantly coming back year upon year, you do have to ask, well, what are your outcomes? And you say, well, the outcomes are, could you please tell us? And they couldn't come back with anything. So they were unaware how to come back and say, well, have we got any money for this? Can you prove what you've done with it? So if you apply for £10,000 for chairs, how many chairs did you buy? We never got anything back. And that was a problem within the committee itself, is that we had nothing back from it.
Thank you. Mr. Bart.
Yeah, presumably this was being looked at in conjunction with the fact that we've got a funding gap of about 80 million opening up over the next 3 years, and the things like special educational needs, adult social care are really struggling for funds. So we're really looking to concentrate on our core duties as a council. Is that correct?
Yes, it is. I mean, when you look at these organisations, the money allocated to them was to offset some of the work that the county council would perhaps have to do because of that. But if we were to take that money and provide that service through our core organisations, we would know exactly where that money is spent. Unfortunately, with these organisations, they had no metrics for that. So we don't know where that money is being spent. And even if it does make an impact on what the county council would have to spend.
Thank you. Thank you. Do we want to just continue with Mr. Smith, or does Mr. Purnell also want to remain on this item? Were you happy? Wait, no, fine. Okay. So Mr. Richardson.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's always regrettable when we have to look at taking measures of this nature. But to me, the original grant system was set up many years ago for small community groups, for community cohesion. And I think sadly it's grown into something else over the years. I mean, I know of one recipient of Shire grant funding who's had 37,000 offers over the last 2 years. They currently have £300,000 in the bank. They're employing a full-time member of staff that we've contributed to their salary at £16.50 an hour. And I'm not quite sure that's what the grant should be for. And I think what's happened is people have got on the bandwagon quite naturally because they're there to raise money for their organisations. I'm not criticising them at all, and come to us. And I think therefore the scheme has probably moved away from its original intention. So, reluctantly, I would support this because I don't think we have any choice in the current financial environment. I think the organisations that predominantly are receiving the funds are not the correct ones in the current environment. And I'm pleased to notice that the chairman of the panel has already said that for the remainder of this financial year, we will not be giving repeat funding to those that have had it previously. We will look to support, those small groups that we should have been supporting previously. So I said it's regrettable. Unfortunately, I think as Mr. Barclay has already said, it's no real choice to the council in the current environment. If we had money coming out of areas, it might be a different scenario, but sadly we don't. And if we do this, and if you then look at the ongoing costs, I mean, to spend more than 10% on what you give to these organisations in the running costs to this council cannot be sustainable or viable.
Did you want to come back on that? Yes.
Yeah, thank you for the comments. The panel found it exactly the same thing, really. In an ideal world, these grants would continue. We would continue to fund them, albeit that they do need to be more accountable for the money that they're allocated. But again, originally when these grants were came up with and formulated, they were designed as seed grants. I think it's now enveloped outside that, and it's become a much bigger thing where you've got larger organisations with turnover of upwards of £500,000 a year applying for grants with large staff members and things like that, and even town and parish councils asking for money when they can raise their own precept. And we do have to consider the financial constraints that the county council is under. And obviously, when the sun's shining, we can make hay. When it's not, we do have to look at things that we can make savings on. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Poland.
Thank you, and thank you, Craig, for the work you and the panel have done. I know it's been a detailed piece of work, so thank you and your colleagues for that. I know some of the organisations listed here, indeed some of the people listed there that came to speak to the panel, and the work they do is fantastic. There's simply no question about that in my mind. But the problem that we've got, and the thing that has been overhanging this, and frankly every other item I think we've ever discussed since I've been here in 2017, is our funding situation. And unfortunately we are the lowest funded county, and that is going to mean we have to make some incredibly difficult decisions. This is one of those, and there's no question about that. But for me, if we continue this funding, then we have to think, well, where's that money coming from elsewhere in the budget? Where are we taking it elsewhere? And I think the low-hanging fruit is gone, and we're going to have to, as I say, in order to ensure our survival as an organisation, we're going to have to make decisions that we otherwise wouldn't do, as Mr. Richardson says, in different circumstances. So I do support this report and the work that you've done, albeit sadly and reluctantly, but under the circumstances necessarily.
Yeah, it's a sign of the times, unfortunately. We don't have the money. This is obviously a considerable expenditure to the county council as well. But I think obviously by funding it this year at a reduced budget and then cessation as of next year, hopefully the county council will be able to take stock of the wins that the grant scheme has had as well. And at a future date when funding is more readily available, perhaps we can restart something along the same lines, but with a more pinpointed view of how we can help people.
Mr. Morgan.
Thank you very much, Chair. So, I mean, I'd like to repeat many of the comments that Mr. Poland just made about the work of these groups. I mean, the list is pretty extensive of those that I know talked to the panel, but particularly of the organisations that have applied for grants. I mean, irrespective, I think, of what they're necessarily applying for. I mean, at the end of it, the rules of who's allowed to apply are our rules as an organisation. It's not the charities or the organisations that are applying for them. If we've effectively allowed them to make the application because they fit the criteria, then that's the responsibility for that is with us as an organisation, not necessarily with those organisations. So I think, obviously there's sort of comments on tweaking for the remaining of the programme, tweaking the application procedures and the amounts that people can apply for, and that's something that we could have done at any point, I think, historically. So that's certainly under our control. So absolutely no criticism at all of any of the organisations that have made or been awarded grants. They've done so perfectly within the rules that we've set as an organisation, and at any point, if we wanted to change those rules, it would have been possible for us to do so. I mean, I absolutely accept, we are at the point of making very, very hard decisions about what we can do and what we can't do. This particular meeting is full of papers where it's quite evident where, we are probably going to, as an organisation, have to continue to make quite difficult decisions about what can be afforded and can't be afforded, so we can actually support some of the core services that we do as an organisation. And as a result, this sort of discussion is probably going to get repeated at many meetings to come, both here and also within Cabinet and also at full council. And it's beholden, I think, on all councillors to accept that we can't do everything. We have to make some difficult decisions, and some of those decisions we know will have implications on third-party organisations, and there is no blame on those organisations, and full understanding that those decisions are not always necessarily beneficial to them. But as an organisation, we are beholden to make those decisions, hard or otherwise.
Yeah, I totally agree with Mr. Morgan. I mean, some of the organisations that presented to us were absolutely fantastic, and the work that they do is really needed within the community. There was a lot of the stuff that when they came in, I was not even aware that we were supporting these people. I mean, for example, Love for Life, I went and visited after the meetings and spoke to them. I had a tour of their facilities, and they gave me an in-depth review of what they did, and the work they do is outstanding, and it's something that I personally will support within my division, the wider county council. But go back to the original remit is we just don't have the money, unfortunately, and we have got to make these tough decisions. I think every single member in the room, if we had a bottomless pit of money, we would fund these organisations without a doubt. But we do have to make tough challenges. That's what we're here for.
Yeah, Mr. Galton.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It was an interesting report, and I think it was Mrs. Page that had suggested that it was important to do this rather before the decision was made. So I think that's welcome. I think, it was clear that we couldn't carry on with the amount of funding as we were. But I think what I'm disappointed is that we're going from basically what we're doing at the moment to nothing within a year. Just looking down this list, we say that some of these groups, some members have questioned the value, but I mean, some of them, it seems to me, are providing services that are relieving and helping the council and sustaining people. So let's look at some of these individuals who are not in employment, education or training. So NEETs, that's clearly a target group, including disadvantaged people, reducing crime, offending and antisocial behaviour in communities. Goodness knows we need to focus on that. And taking responsibility for identifying solutions and local issues and providing voluntary sector, community and social enterprise. So I don't think we can say that we can just take this money out and there won't be an impact in the communities as much as it will be for the groups and organisations that provide it. So I was hoping that there might be a recommendation for a small amount of funding that was much more targeted, got away from some of the issues that Mr. Smith has identified. I think the overheads were getting to the point where they were quite significant. I agree, I fully understand we've got to go through a proper process because it is public money. But I think, yes, I'm disappointed. I'd hope there might be a recommendation that would have involved keeping a much smaller amount of money available for targeted purposes and some of these groups where clearly there's a need going on beyond
the next year. So that was quite disappointing. I just got one question then. So it's quite clear there's quite a few staff involved in delivering these grants. And I appreciate that it's not their full-time job. They obviously do other roles. But did the panel consider what the impact will be on the staff that deliver these programmes? Is there going to be some redundancies as a result of this? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair. We weren't told that there was going to be any redundancies. No, it was basically the staff would be redistributed elsewhere. This is not their full-time job. Going back to what you were saying about the organisations and the funding as well, I totally agree with you. You know, some of this stuff is really, really needed within the communities. But one thing that came apparent during the panel review meetings was the fact that there are so many other funding companies out there, funding organisations rather. And these organisations have a much bigger pot of money than we do, and that's what they do. So things like Lloyd's came to visit us. We also had the National Lottery as well, and their funding is tenfold what we can give out as well. So we're still going to be using our officers to push those, signpost them into the right direction. So these people are not going to be left out. There's going to be provision to help them and signpost them over the course of the next 12 months. And that was one of the really important things that the panel's findings, that we're not going to cease the grant funding this year. We are going to allow it to run for another year so that these companies, these organisations are not just left in the lurch. They've got 12 months to work with our officers who can then signpost them in the direction so that they're going to be sustainable for the future. And that's a big thing. These organisations, although they do fantastic work, they have to be sustainable in order to meet their objectives as well. Thank you.
Mrs. Page.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Smith, and do thank your team. And I think taking the magnitude of this and it was a really good job that the panel did look at this in detail. Now, I don't want to echo all of the comments because everything has been said, but I would like to just go back to what you have said. Now, there are an awful lot of funders out there. We are looking at running this for at least another year, depends what the decision of the cabinet is. It's obvious that members around this table, or a majority of the members, are quite supportive of the recommendation. But I was wondering, have you looked at how these decisions, if the cabinet were to make this decision, is going to be communicated out there? Will there be, in years ago, we had a funding Bible where all the funders were identified, you know, these organisations can go to, how they can access them. For instance, in Harborough, we did have what we called a kind of like a dragon's den we set up once a year where all the organisations can meet all of the funders. Will all of the organisations be written to? So just talk me through that as I'm the last speaker to just wrap it up nicely. And thank you again to you and your team.
Yeah, good question. Obviously, we are not just providing grants for the same people each year. These grants have to apply to us. So with regards to the communication, obviously we will still be saying that we are funding Shire grants and Shire environmental grants this year. So we will get people coming in with applications. Going forward, those communications won't be going out. But one of the things that both Noel Singh and Andy Hayes were doing, they do a fantastic job in the back room of signposting these organisations to other people as well. Now that will be obviously more prevalent this year as they inform these people that, particularly the ones that come back for future funding, repeat funding each year. Well, perhaps you can look at this funding mechanism or this funding stream next year, and that's how that will hopefully go.
Do any other members of the committee have any other comments? Questions? No. Okay. Oh, so yes, Mr.
Clear what the outcome of this is. You know, we've got the report. We either go along with what the panel's recommending, or we could say something different to the cabinet.
Yes, I mean, I think I was just going to make some final concluding comments and then move on to whether we support the recommendations being put to the cabinet.
Thank you, Chair.
And then obviously people can vote in favour or against. So thank you for coming today, Mr. Smith, and going through the report findings and answering questions. Just from my own point of view on this. It's pretty clear looking through the community shire grants figures that there was an expansion of the programme during COVID, and obviously partly that was due to the extra funding that was being brought in and the extra pressures that were being called upon the grants. I do wonder from a personal perspective whether there could have been changes to the scheme instead of abolition, whether there could have been a return to the lower amounts of grants that were available before COVID, before the scheme expanded so much, and whether there could be rules brought in, which I think we're already saying about not allowing repeat grants and just concentrating on the smaller community and voluntary groups with the grants. So from a personal perspective, although I see where the general opinion tends to be, I do think that a reduced scheme with more restrictive rules might have been better than abolishing the scheme altogether. Did you want to make any final comments on the report before we move on to considering whether the committee is going to accept? So,
Sure. I think I've pretty much covered everything that I was going to say. None of us want to get rid of helping other people. That's what we all got elected for, to help people and help organisations that help people as well. But in times when we don't have the money, we have to make difficult decisions. And that's exactly what this panel did. We were presented with the evidence. On balance, we found that, you know, moving forward with a reduced funding this year and the cessation was the better way to go. And I think from a personal point of view as well, as I think in the future, we can maybe revisit the Shire grant system, but run it from the ground up rather than trying to cut little pieces away and trying to change this or that and the other. Because remember, there is quite a substantial officer time base on this as well. So starting from upwards rather than looking backwards and trying to chop and change, I think might be a better way of moving the entire thing forward. But for the time being, I think we've made the right decision. I think we've made the only decision available to the panel as well. And I'd really appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. So now we move on to voting on whether we support the recommendations being put forward to the Cabinet. So I suppose all those in favour of the recommendations and those against. Okay, that's carried. Okay. Right, thank you, Mr. Smith. So we move on to item 11, which is provisional revenue and capital outturn 2022-2023. Which starts on page 25 of the agenda pack. Declan Keegan, the Director of Corporate Resources, will introduce this item, and he is supported by Nick Wash, Head of Finance. We've also the lead member for Resources, Mr. Brecken, with us today. Welcome, Mr. Brecken. Declan, if you want to present this item, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I was going to pass over to Nick, who'll just take us briefly through the report, if that's okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Declan. So yes, this report summarises the provisional financial outturn for the 2022-23 financial year. The overall position is showing a 6.7 million underspend on revenue. So see paragraph 5 for that, and a variance of 29.6 million on the capital programme, which arises from 28.5 million slippage and 1.1 million of underspend, and paragraph 13 summarises that. So moving on to sort of more detail on the revenue budget, starting from paragraph 15. Appendix A provides a summary of the overall revenue position, and there's a lot more details in Appendix B on the individual variances. On the CFS schools budget, there's an overall overspend of 5.9 million, 6.7 million overspend on the high needs block, and the 1 million on early years is in part offset by a 1.8 million underspend on the schools block. And whilst the 6.7 million overspend is less than the 8.9 million forecast when the budget was set, the high needs position continues to be a major financial challenge. The cumulative deficit has now reached 35.3 million. On the Children and Family Service Local Authority budget, services were overspent by 3.1 million, driven by pressures around children's social care, including unaccompanied asylum seekers. There are a number of factors feeding into this, and paragraphs 25 to 31 kind of outline it, but essentially increased demand, especially for more complex cases, coupled with ongoing difficulties of recruiting social workers, given the national shortage of qualified staff. Moving on to adults and communities, again, there's a 3.1 million overspent for adult social care at the end of at the year end. Number of factors feeding into this overall figure, and the details are given in paragraphs 24 to 42. But essentially, increased demands mitigated in part by additional income, combined with some staffing underspends. The overall position for environment and transport is an underspend of 1.8 million, but this is made up of an overspend on transport budgets of 3 million, offset by underspends on highways 2.5 million and waste management 2.3 million. And paragraphs 46 to 48 provide more detail on that. In terms of corporate resources, there's a net overspend of 1.6 million. This is made up of 2.9 million overspend on commercial services, where recovery from the pandemic, coupled with significant inflationary pressures, have contributed to sort of what has been a very difficult year, especially within catering services. There's also an overspend on the Investing in Leicestershire programme due to the timing of the receipt of private debt income, and also the need to increase the provision for bad debts. Also a separate section later in the reports on this, which we'll come on to. Those overspends have been offset by a number of underspends in other areas, primarily relating to staffing across a range of the support services. In terms of central items, the inflation contingency was overspent by £7.1 million in the year. Fortunately, there was no call on the 8 million MTFS risk contingency, which can be used to offset that excess inflationary impact. Retained business rates pool money, which was previously available to the LEP for investment in the local economy, has now been reallocated back to local authority bodies, and that results in a change of treatment. So essentially it funds additional capital in the year, but in essence just replaces other capital funds in the year, freeing them up to be spent in future years. And in terms of bank and other interest, this has exceeded the budget by a total of 7.2 million due to the significant stepped increase to the Bank of England base rate over the financial year. And in addition to this, cleansing of old purchase orders has freed up £2.3 million. Paragraph 65 explains how the 6.7 million underspend is intended to be used. 3.5 million will be used to increase the credit loss allowance against outstanding debts, primarily in adult social care. Debt recovery has been problematic over the pandemic period, and as a result, there is an increasing likelihood of having to write off a number of debts. This won't impact on debt recovery activity, so just to be clear on that. The debts will still be pursued in line with the existing policy. And if recovery is successful, the provision will continue to be reassessed and released if it is found no longer likely to be required going forward. And then 3 million of the underspend is to be reallocated to offset the increasing pressures on highway maintenance activity. Chair, do you want me to pause there on the revenue side before moving on to the reserves and capital, or shall I carry on?
We can pause there if members have any. Do you have a question, Mr. Galton?
Yeah, a few, I'm afraid, Chairman. It's always important, the end of year accounts. What we've got here is the Cabinet report. In fact, there are a few recommendations in here to the Cabinet that didn't get taken out. But I appreciate we're looking at it from a scrutiny perspective. So, yeah, could I start then with paragraph 10? We all saw the photographs of Mr. Brecken and Declan sitting in 11 Downing Street with the leader, and 6 of the 7 MPs. One wasn't there. Not sure why that was. So can we understand then? So in paragraph 10, you're saying nothing came out of that meeting that gave you the confidence to make any kind of provision for additional funding coming forward. So what there was a lot of publicity around it. What a wonderful meeting it was. It was, we achieved this, and MPs tweeting. It was great to see the leader and but what were the outcomes of that meeting? You left a document with them. They're doing further work. There's going to be a meeting with the junior minister in the Levelling Up department. I'm really not clear what the outcomes were of that meeting, Chairman. So if we could start with that.
I mean, I'd say if you go into paragraph 11, it actually answers the question, Simon, but it's pending the outcome of discussions with the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, the MTFS does not include any provision for any floor funding. He took away our document that was obviously put together by Chris Tambini, our former director, and he looked at it and he said it was good to actually have a solution in front of him. And he said he would then work with his teams, and it wouldn't happen overnight. He was very honest about that, and we just now have to wait. We don't have an update at the moment, but we are hoping to have meetings with Michael Gove's department on the back of this, because one of his ministers, Lee Rowley, was at that meeting as well. He was invited in, and we just have to wait. It's been a long fight, and I'm sure it's not going to be an overnight solution, but we don't have any further updates, do we, Declan?
The only thing I'd ask is we've also got a meeting with sort of officials that hopefully we can get into the detail a little bit of what the practicalities would be. So I suppose it is nudging forward. I suppose what we're hoping for is influence. We do accept it's a sort of a bigger, wider system change, but we can start chipping away and trying to skew whatever solution they come up with to benefit authorities like Leicestershire. I suppose that's the goal, really.
So through your chair, is our specific request, paragraph 11, that we want some system of floor funding? Is that what we're asking for? So that there is a kind of floor below which we can't fall below, and then is it not correct that the outcome of any changes wouldn't just be for Leicestershire? It would be as part of the fair funding review, and that's been pushed back to when now?
So picking those up bit by bit. So the floor we see is a kind of I suppose, part of an overall solution, but recognising that they're not going to do full funding reform until 25-26 at the earliest. So it's definitely been pushed back into the next Parliament. So the appeal of a floor is it's relatively cheap in the scheme of kind of government finances, and it's very targeted as well. So hence the floor's put forward as something they could do sooner if needed. But it's a feature you'd like to see of the overall reforms. But overall reforms are the ultimate goal.
So they could adjust the floor in the present system to help us if they wanted to.
One of the appeals was because that's what they did with schools. So we know that they've got a track record of introducing it as a mechanism. Hence, what we're trying to do is sort of find the path of least resistance. So we're hoping that something like a floor could be put in advance of the next Parliament. But, as Lee's touched on, whether that's actually practical with the state of the national finance, another thing. But like I say, we're just trying to find that path of least resistance.
Okay, thank you, Chair. That's helpful to understand. But it sounds to me like there's not much hope of any improvement in the situation before the next general election, but we'll see how it goes. So then on support services, I think obviously we know the situation there, that they're still trying to recover. Sorry, not support services, LTS. I still think, the school food programme that we're doing is one of the best in the country. And I know you want to try and get that back into profit by looking at expanding. And the challenges have been absolutely enormous, haven't they, with COVID and trying to recover from that. But I think the one that surprised me was Bow Manor. Just what a wonderful asset that is. I don't understand. I mean, most significant tourist attractions now are, really doing quite well, particularly when the weather's good, offering a range of services. I just wonder whether, not suggesting we haven't got all the skills we need, but I'm just wondering whether it would help to have someone from the commercial sector have a look at Bow Manor to see what they could do with it in terms of trading, what opportunities there are. I mean, it's just such an incredible asset for the county. And I just wonder if we're maximising the trading opportunities. I know it says in the report, looking at ideas for that. Traditionally, it's been focused on school visits and they're not coming forward. Obviously, school budgets are tight at the moment. So maybe we need to diversify and look at other areas where people might want to look at Bow Manor, or indeed provide functions and services. I know you do a good trade in weddings, but perhaps we could expand that to other events as well. So that's just a plea on that one, please, Chairman. And then finally, on the business rates, pleased to see that some of that retained money is coming back. What I'm picking up in more of a rumour is that there is a debate going on at the moment about the split. So at the moment it's a 30%, 33% presumably, 33% to the county, 33% to the city, and then 33% shared by the district and boroughs. I'm picking up through Lee, that the administration's not happy with that, that's challenging that and wants a higher amount for the county. It's not mentioned in this report, but that's going to require some sort of decision. But I'm also picking up, quite understandably, that the city council isn't going to have that. They're not going to stand for that. And if it was forced from here, then they would pull the plug on it, and then all the money would go back to the government and we get nothing. So my plea this morning is that you explain what is going on here, what the timescales are for decision, and why. I mean, it seems, just on the face of it, it seems a pretty fair sort of share, 33, 33, 33 across the areas. I don't know what other members think, but yeah, this is quite worrying. I wonder what you could add to that. Thank you, Chair.
Do you want to pick up initially and then Lee can sort of chip in? In terms of Bow Manor, it might be that the next agenda item picks up on the trade service. It might be going into a bit of detail there, but in terms of some of your suggestions, Richard's sort of got some of those in hand. So he's had an external review. They've got a sort of a wedding consultant in, because Bow Manor's always a bit of a tale of two halves in some ways. You've got the sort of the outdoor activity side, which has done very well historically, but then the hall is a bit more kind of problematic in some ways in terms of getting that to function. So it might be when Richard's up that we get into that one a little bit more, but he is working in line with sort of some of the suggestions you've made. In terms of the business rate pool, I mean, as you'd expect, kind of we've moved from the situation with the sort of the LEP on its sort of kind of it's on wind down now in some ways to the end of the financial year. We need a different approach to allocating the funding, and in truth, because the LEP had employed a bidding approach, it's always one of those. It's good initially because in theory it should sort of enable good prioritisation, but the flip side of that is it's an awful lot of work and it takes an awful lot of time to get the money out. So there was always a bit of debate about whether that was the right way. So the problem it means though is then you've suddenly got to agree that the split, and although a third sounds fair, when you look at where the economic growth is going to fall, it's falling into the county area rather than sort of the city area. And that's the position the county council was wanting to take, in that it's kind of a recognition of, you know, if you're going to have economic growth, that comes with a cost to the public purse, and a sort of a recognition through that. But as you've touched on, the prize is to kind of keep the pool together rather than money just going back to the government. So there's still some internal debate on that, and there's going to be a cabinet report to the June cabinet that just sort of sets out a position on that.
Just come back to him, that is really playing a very dangerous game, because if you push the city too far and they pull the plug, then nobody gets a penny. It all goes back to central government. It's very, very high stakes. I mean, perhaps Lee could comment on the political aspects of this, because on the whole, Mr. Ruston's made a fist of having a good relationship with the city mayor, but this sounds like it could damage it.
I think you've been a bit unfair. I think the relationship between the leader of the county council and the leader of the city council, they're both completely different ball games as far as city versus county, but I think we have good ground to ask, as Declan's outlined, that we have most of that growth falls within our area, and I think we're quite right, and I think members around the Scrutiny Commission would want us to make sure we're fighting for our fair pot. So I think the allocations this time around have been a third. I think that's been agreed, so those monies will be released, but yeah, we'll continue to fight for where we think the money needs to be given. So I think that's fair. So it's but I don't think the relationship between the mayor and the leader of the county council is any worse than it's ever been. So
what is the date for having to inform the government that we've got agreement on the pool? Is there a date for having to tell them?
So you confirm with the government by the end of October each year, but there's obviously sort of local agreements and needing sort of, I suppose, put any arrangements in place well in advance of that. So, but that is the cut-off in terms of whether you're going to make any changes to the pool.
Any other members have? Mr. Richardson.
Just a couple of things. I wasn't going to comment on the pool, but I will. I mean, I am in agreement with Simon on this one that whatever happens, that money's got to be retained in Leicester and Leicestershire. So there's got to be a mechanism. Where I disagree with Simon is Simon talks about the city and the county. There are 9 members of the pool, 7 of whom are district. Every member gets 1 vote. So it's not as simple as the county and city agreeing. It's the county, city, and districts would need to agree on how the pool is split and used. And again, there's nothing to stop any of those recipients actually working collegiately cross-border on items. I mean, we've seen one, for instance, which is where money has been put in for Desford Crossroads. I appreciate it's been delayed because of trying to buy the bit of land under compulsory purchase, but there is an area where we as a council have fronted up a bid. It's been accepted by the other partners who put money in for an infrastructure project which would benefit a wider region, particularly where it is on the border of Hinckley and Blaby, etc. So I think it does work well. I mean, I would urge my colleagues through Lee that I think the county benefits out of this. I think the districts benefit, the city benefit out of this. So I would urge that the pool be retained and that dialogue takes place. And there is a mechanism for it to take place with the leaders of the respective councils. Coming on to the report in general, because it's a historic report going backwards, I think what I'd like to highlight, particularly with my adults communities hat on, is that we've seen an issue in the last financial year with adults communities actually needing more resources because of the circumstances coming out of COVID. But I'd actually say to members and to the public out there that, if you look back at what just as one department that's done over the last 4 years, where they brought in the target operating model run by Newton Europe, most of the additional funds that are being spent now are the funds that were saved over that period because of the foresight of this council in looking actively at how it runs its service. So one of the things that being restricted in funding does give you is it gives you the need to actually be as innovative as possible. So I wouldn't like the public to get the impression out that it's all one way. This council has done a huge amount of work, credit to officers and members, about what they've done to reduce costs but not reduce the quality of service going forward. And again, there's the law of unintended consequences, isn't there? With the government's desire to get people out of hospitals quicker, they threw money at it, which pushed up the care home costs, and therefore it puts the spaces at a premium, etc. But certainly in adults community, they're doing a huge amount of additional work. I mean, one of the strange things we have in Leicestershire, for instance, is that we have fewest number of nursing places funded by the NHS than any county in the country. Now, that cannot be right. There's nothing unique about Leicestershire. So again, a lot of work is being done, particularly by the director, in understanding why it is the NHS doesn't feel the need to fund places in Leicestershire, which it funds across the border in Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire. So I think this is where innovation across all of the areas of the county has come into, I won't say giving us a decent budget, but giving us a budget which is considerably better than it would otherwise have been, leading to even more difficult decisions than we're being asked to make at the moment, had we as a council not taken these decisions and actually been innovative. So it wasn't a question, it was really just to say thank you to everybody for pitching in and doing what we can to actually do the best for our residents in challenging times.
Anyone else have any other comments on this part of the report? Okay, so back to you, Nick. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So moving on to the section starting at paragraph 66, that lays out the general fund balance, which sits at 19 million, which equates to roughly 3.7% of the revenue budget. In addition, there are 195 million of earmarked reserves, the majority of which are to be used to fund the capital programme going forwards. There's more of a breakdown on the details of those various balances in Appendix C. Moving on to the section in paragraph 86, this provides information on the County Council's cash flow loan to the East Midlands Freeport. The loan is on commercial terms and is in advance of the Freeport's own funding streams coming online from the growth in retained business rates, rising from occupation on EMF's sites. The cash flow loan has an upper limit, of 4 million, and will be drawn down under delegation from the Cabinet by the Director of Corporate Resources in consultation with the lead member for resources. Deputy leader, sorry, yeah. So in terms of the capital, the tables in paragraph 91 and 92 break down the 29.6 million variance by department. The main variances are highlighted in Appendix D. I'm picking out on just some of the key ones. For CFS, there was a variance of 12.4 million. The main elements being net slippage of 7.3 million on the provision of additional school places and 3.3 million on the SEND programme. In the E&T, there was net slippage of 7.6 million across a range of schemes, the details of which are provided in paragraph 109. In corporate resources, there was slippage of 2.3 million, the main element of which was on the Ways of Working programme. And then finally, on the corporate programme, there was net slippage of 5.7 million, which comprised 14 million of slippage on a range of schemes, which are listed in paragraph 115, but offset by 8.8 million of pooled infrastructure funds being invested in 2022-23 rather than as originally planned in 2023-24. And as mentioned earlier, in paragraph 117 begins a section on the investing in Leicestershire Fund. Overall, a return of 2.7% net income return was achieved on the fund over the year. The return is 0.6 million less than budgeted for, driven down by a sort of difficult year with the need to increase bad debt provisions and private debt investors holding onto funds for longer to manage the hedging required against the falling pound midway through the year. Given that the pound has since recovered against the dollar, the fund managers have sort of kind of given us a bit of reassurance that this position will rectify itself going forward. So we're confident that the following financial year, or the financial year we're in now, we'll see that kind of pick up significantly. That was all I was going to comment on, Chair. So
thank you, Nick. So do members have any questions, comments about the report? This is
Thank you, Chair. There's an awful lot of slippage identified within the provision of school places and SEND school places, but the impact of that isn't really detailed as clearly. I wondered whether you can talk me through the impact. What we saw in the first part of the report, the pressure on the school budget and the SEND budget by not being able to deliver these places in time. What knock-on impact does that have, particularly knowing how difficult we this struggle we're having with SEND at the moment? What impact is that having, and how do we claw that back?
Well, inevitably it does have an impact, but I mean, what we're talking about is obviously a hard cut-off at an end of a financial year. So slippage between financial years does happen on a regular basis, and so this is, from that point of view, this isn't out of kilter with what we would normally see. There's a whole host of reasons why the capital kind of works associated with schools are taking longer, not least obviously kind of inflationary process, increasing costs, etc. Perhaps difficulty getting some of the kind of contractors on board to deliver the works, etc. But there's no kind of, I mean, the impact on the revenue budget is not significant in terms of the delay in places. It will pick itself up as those places are delivered further down the line.
Sorry, can I come back? That wasn't really the question. The question was, if we're slipping in terms of, are we slipping in terms of the delivery of the school places? Are they going to be delivered in time? And are those school places going to be available because of that financial slip in time from we were expecting? Because obviously we have the number of children that are we saw in the we in a later report actually in terms of the complaints with allocations, in terms of transfer places, there's huge pressure in terms of making sure there are enough school places. Will this financial slip mean that places aren't ready in time when we're expecting them to be ready, or are we anticipating that that slippage will come back into line and therefore those places will be available when we need them?
I think there's a mixture of both there. There possibly will be some delay in terms of some of those places being ready when they're needed, but there's also a factor of actually some of the slippages because the places aren't needed at the time that they were originally intended to. So, you know, for example, some developments, housing developments slip, etc., the pressures aren't coming on as quickly as was perhaps expected. So I'd say there's probably a bit of a combination of both factors on that.
Mr. Galton, you hand up. Yes, thank you, Chair. Just seeking some further information on a couple of areas that's slipping variances. This bridge, it's been going on for years. Keep bringing every year it comes up, and I think we've had detailed reports on what the problems are. And is it right on the edge of the county? And there was some issue with the neighbouring authority and all that. I mean, the amount of time that officers have had to spend just writing about this must be costing a lot of money as well. What is the problem? When can we actually get this scheme delivered and off? So that's the first one. The other one that's worrying me a bit, notwithstanding obviously there was a judicial legal action by the health authorities, is the east of Lutterworth, because this is crucial to both delivery in housing and infrastructure. And really, I'm thinking the concerns that Nick alluded to on some of the other issues. Inflationary pressures are starting to make some sites a bit wobbly on viability issues, and that's in the private sector. Developers coming forward saying we can't afford to provide the infrastructure that you've asked us to. The costs are racketing. Now, you know, what are the main issues here? The judicial review's gone now. It is really for us, for the county council, to deliver this scheme. What are the problems in bringing this one forward, please, Chair?
The first one, the infamous Zoch Bridge. So it's kind of, I mean, you're exactly right. It's been sort of dragging on for quite a while, and part of the issues has been kind of or the main issue has been sort of the increase in cost has been running ahead of the ability to sort of find funding. Now, the most recent one that we did try was a levelling up bid, which unfortunately was unsuccessful. So we found that out after the start of the year. So the next round for levelling up hasn't opened, and it's starting to look a bit kind of, you know, will that come too late anyway? So the intention is to use sort of the initial gain from the business rate pooling to top up the funding for that will allow us to sort of like progress Soch Bridge. So they're working through that kind of positively. And in truth, not all the work's been wasted, because obviously the design as it were. So it's a lot of the stuff that has been done isn't wasted effort now that it's going to go ahead. So they're working through that, and they'll go out to competitive procurement on that to make sure we get the best price that we can. In terms of Lutterworth East, you're right. The judicial review sort of period's passed, which sort of so I suppose it takes that sort of cloud from the development. But it's, I suppose, bearing in mind that sort of the planning permissions was sort of almost a pre-COVID kind of exercise, and the world's changed quite a lot. Whether inflationary pressures isn't the only one. What you do with sort of office buildings and things like that. So obviously, sort of the planning permission was sort of like at a point in time. So it's just working through as you've touched on, really sort of that viability. What's the sort of what's in the scheme? What would potentially need to sort of could be adjusted or need to change to make it a viable scheme? But it's still a scheme that we're sort of committed to as an authority. It just may take a different form, just reflecting how the world around us has changed. In truth, like any other scheme.
Just on a sort of similar sort of theme, really. One thing that would benefit the residents of my division greatly, whilst the actual work would be in the neighbouring division, but it stops my division or large parts of it being used as a rat run, would be the building of the Enderby Relief Road, or the Enderby Bypass, whatever you like to call it, which is to be fully funded by the developers. But with the delays which are happening on the council giving agreement for that, my concern is that the cost might escalate to an extent where the developers don't feel inclined to fund that road. Now, bearing in mind, it also removes a major air quality issue from the county, as it's one of the major air quality zones in the issue. I just wondered if are we looking from a financial aspect at the ability to speed some of these things up, because long term it will be major cost to this council if such schemes disappear, which are being offered by developers, but which we wouldn't have to fund, because it would leave us with needing to do some work on junctions, perhaps Enderby crossroads, that we might not otherwise have to do were that road to exist. Now, I know there are some issues with it because the road goes across a gas landfill site, which I understand can be mitigated. But do we actively look at those things as a way of bringing down the budget costs in this? And I wonder if there's any way of linking some of these developer-led schemes into reports like this, so that we are aware as councillors what those schemes might be across the county that could assist this council greatly, because we don't have to find the money and spend it ourselves.
To be honest, I don't know the detail of the Enderby scheme. There is a preference where possible that the developers do undertake it. Like, obviously, they're sort of set up on site. They tend to be able to do it cheaper than we can. We're just sort of coming in sort of fresh as it were. So there is that skew. The difference is where it tends to be sort of multiple developers, and we end up in that role of a coordinator. So, I mean, I don't know the details behind the Enderby scheme. I'd suggest that if the scrutiny did want to report on that, it'd be probably better served as a sort of a separate E&T report, and then you can get the right officers along to kind of get into the detail a bit rather than a monitoring report.
I'll just come back on that. For the point of clarity, this would be a fully developer funded scheme. All they need is permission from our highways department to build it. I mean, it's as simple as that. And then to adopt the road afterwards.
Did you want to? I think I just endorse what Declan says. I think, yeah, the children's, the adults and the environmental transport scrutiny committees are probably best placed to deal with a lot of what's questions that have been raised here in detail. And I think it would be good and useful if perhaps they went through those relevant committees, you know, to sort of look at the detail of some of the questions that have been asked by members today. This item.
It could be referred to the Highway and Transport Committee then. Okay. I've got Mrs. Page and then Mr. Frisbee.
Thank you, Chairman. And if I'm looking at page 64 and 65, the corporate resources issue, and there is, hang on, yeah, no, sorry. If I'm going right down, corporate program slippage of 5.7 is forecast compared with the updated budget. And underneath it are several projects. And in line with Councillor Galton and Councillor Richardson, I'm worried that if these schemes there is a constant slippage, and I do appreciate that circumstances over the last few years have been a contributor to this, but if these keep slipping, the slippage of 5.7 million will go up and up and up. So my question really is, overall, these schemes have already cost us a great deal of money, which isn't reflected in this report. We are just talking slippage, which doesn't seem to be, on the big scheme of things, 5.7 million is not all that much, but then the overall cost could be quite considerable. So what are we actually, question number one, would it be maybe worth reporting on what the schemes cost us so far in the preparation to get an overall view, but also what are we actively doing to now moving these projects along that this slippage doesn't keep reoccurring? Thank you.
Can I just say, the Investing in Leicestershire Programme Board met last week, and we actually had an update. John Bennett and his team give us an update on a quarterly basis for those boards, and that information is there, and I'm sure we could sort of make sure that you're aware of it. This is obviously the end of year report for last year, so the updates are given, each project's looked at in specific detail, and that information is available.
Yeah, thank you. But how do members get to see those reports, and then how are they informed? Because it would be really good if as Scrutiny we could see them as part of, our evaluations of the system.
The overall cost of the schemes that you referred to is when we do the annual MTFS process, we bring together the kind of the, so I suppose every year of costs plus the totality that's been there as well. And when there is movement on, obviously this is kind of just tries to pick up the main points of interest to summarise it as a report instead of kind of, I suppose, giving you the same information each time. But I mean, the main one you picked out, the 5.7, isn't a slippage. That's a scheme that's no longer intended to proceed. So So I suppose, so the biggest item there isn't one that's just going to keep reappearing. That once it's through this sort of MTFS cycle, that's when that one will disappear completely.
Question to Mr. Brecken. Could we have a link to that information, please? So we could.
Boards. Okay, boards are private, but I'm sure we can get you an update. John Bennett produces an update. We've had them at member briefings before, so I'm sure they're available. Annual report in September might be a good time for that to come back, so I can get that to you.
Thank you. To Frisbee.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Brecken, and thank you, officers. I don't think I'd be doing my job coming from Melton Mowbray today if I didn't mention the MMDR, the Melton Mowbray Distributor Road. It's pretty much the lion's share of everything I discuss in my office in my capacity as a county councillor. It has become an absolute preoccupation of the people of Melton Mowbray and was a driving factor for the results that were received in our last local election. So in absolute layman's terms, if I'm coming to represent Melton Mowbray, which I am this morning, this afternoon, people are asking me in humble simplicity, what is going on with the Melton Mowbray ring road? If I could just have a summative statement, because I hear a variety of different things of we're getting it all, it's happening. The phrase here is key projects delivered. In my opinion, delivered is what actually comes through the door. And there isn't a ring road around Melton Mowbray at the moment because I've just driven from there. So could I just have a summative statement that I can go back to the people of Melton, and when I'm intercepted in Morrison's and they say, oh, we're getting this ring road or not, I can go back and tell them yes or no. Some of it is we are getting a bit of it. We're getting 3/4 of it. The general feedback is, would I buy a clock with 3/4 of a face? No, I wouldn't. So it would be just really useful as a relatively new member to be able to go back and say to the man on the street, the person, should I say, on the street, this is what I know and this is what was discussed. Thank you, Chair.
I suppose it sort of slight semantics, but just to be clear, it was never going to be a ring road. So it only ever, I don't know what shape you describe it as, but it's more kind of like a fallen over R, I think. But, so the northern eastern section, the work, I suppose a contract has been let and the sort of the work's moving forward on that scheme. It will be it's obviously a multi-year scheme. Is it 2 years it's going to take? Over 2 years. So it is going to be a constant kind of, bit by bit type scheme. But the funding at the moment's in place for that. Obviously, kind of it's a big complex capital scheme. So there's going to be sort of ups and downs as we go through and they actually get on site and you actually start to discover more. But the northeastern section is kind of going ahead. The southern section isn't in the same place. It's just sort of not as developed. The project hasn't been going. So that is still going through kind of, I suppose, assurance, both in terms of the kind of the design and hence the cost of the road, but also the kind of the funding to stack it up. So it's going to be kind of a again, a tale of two halves, as it were. North and eastern, much more positive kind of you'll start to see active things happening on that one. The southern one's still going through kind of, I suppose, project assembly.
Chairman, I come back. So the southern section may still be compromised. I can go back and say with some degree of certainty, we may not ever see a southern section in our working lifetimes. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, they're just still working on it. I mean, until the kind of until in some ways a contract is let and it's reasonably well developed, there's always going to be a degree of uncertainty. But it's just by its nature, it's just a couple of years behind where the northern sort of road is. There's nothing definitive that says it's not going to happen. There's nothing that says it's going to put in, you know, sort of a generational type delay. But you know, these are big multi-years complex projects. You're never quite sure what you're going to find when you open up the sort of the can of worms, as it were. So they're still working on the funding side of things. They're still working on the sort of design elements and working with developers, because it is heavily kind of dependent on developments coming forward, planning permission, etc. as well. So it's unfortunately, it is just the nature of the beast with these sort of schemes that you don't really get any certainty till they're very, very well advanced.
And it's that ambiguity that frustrates our residents. And finally, do we have, Declan, thank you very much for that. Do we have a lead time or a completion time of at least a bit of it will be done that we can actually drive a vehicle on?
The target at the moment is sort of to complete it in the financial year 2025-26. So it's going to be at some point during that year. But I know I keep giving you caveats, which isn't helpful for what you want to do. But the longer a scheme goes on, the more prone it is to kind of, you know, potential delays, etc. But it's at the moment it's forecast sometime in financial year 25-26.
Thank you, Chair.
Maybe we could have a briefing for the relevant members of the divisions on that issue. Anyone else got any questions on? No. Okay. Well, thank you to Lee, Nick, and Declan for presenting and answering questions today. We therefore move on to item 12 on the agenda, which is the Commercial Strategy Annual Update and Performance Review, which is set out on pages 69 to 100 in the agenda. Declan is remaining for the item, and we're joined by Assistant Director Jane Glasgow and Richard Hunt, Head of Catering, Hospitality and Country Parks. I think, Jane, you are introducing this report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So it's been another challenging year for our traded services, with a variance of 2.9 million against the target budget, resulting in a net cost of 3.6 million. Even though many of our services saw a good recovery in business, some back to pre-pandemic levels, the margin position was significantly eroded by wage inflation plus increases in energy and provision costs. Additionally, staffing remained a challenge, mirroring the national position, and winter illness levels were high. Many of our traded services work with schools, and as the school's budget position becomes tighter, this results in a softening of our sales position for some services. Significant improvements have already been made to mitigate the inflationary pressures, but much is still to be done, with work ongoing to improve operational efficiency, refocus our offer based on the evolving supply chain, and win new business, plus improve our commercial contracts. As we work to improve and recover these services, we do anticipate that some services will underperform this year against budget, as the changes will take time to take effect. Additionally, the last commercial services strategy was agreed by Cabinet and ran until 2023. A new strategy has been proposed, now called the Traded Services Strategy, covering the next 5-year period. It refocuses our work within the context of higher inflation, cost of living pressures, and the very different trading environment resulting from the pandemic, war in the Ukraine, etc.
And did you want to add anything, Lee, before we move to questions?
Not at this moment, thank you.
Okay. So, questions, comments from members? Mr. Richardson.
Yeah, thank you for the report. This is one that I've been a bit like a dog with a bone in over the last 5 years, in that we seem to be going backwards rather than forward. Now, I appreciate you're looking to have a refocus, and I appreciate there's a strategy, but what I can't ascertain from the strategy is what is the action plan supporting that strategy. So how are we going to turn these services around? Are we the right people to run them? Is it about time we outsource them? When are we going to get to a definitive point when we make a decision about the way forward? I mean, I look across the country at other councils who tend to have tech halls that they share in, where they have very successful partnerships which contribute greatly to council budgets. So is it about time we thought the radical on this one? Is that within the, because I didn't sense that from the strategy document that we're thinking radically, but again, it could be in the action plan, which I haven't seen, so I don't know. So, I mean, even if we're not able to get to a view today, it would be nice to have this committee have an opportunity to look at a detailed action plan in 6 months' time, for argument's sake, and how we're doing against that action plan, because clearly this is of concern. I mean, clearly there are services we want to do here, but you know, I've got very successful, for instance, cafe businesses in my area where they're looking to expand. So they're clearly making good money and running at a profit, but we seem to can't run one at a profit even. So is it about time I said we were a bit more radical and thought outside the box?
We thought quite hard about how we approach the new strategy, because the previous strategy did try to kind of encompass strategy and action plan within a single document. And because of the nature of traded services being right across the authority, and just as you've pointed out, at varying different levels of efficacy and profitability, we felt kind of one enormous action plan didn't really seem appropriate for the scenario we find ourselves in. So by design, the strategy that members have got in front of them today sets out this mixture of strategic principles and strategic mechanisms that guide how individual services should approach commercial trading going forwards. And then the detail of each of those services will be contained within both the MTFS and within the individual service plans for those services. So that absolutely means that all services should be undertaking the sort of challenges to themselves that Mr. Richardson's outlined, and I know that services are undergoing that at the moment. What we, though, didn't want to set out was a very prescriptive strategy, because the nature and diversity of the services meant that didn't seem appropriate with what we're trying to achieve.
I mean, thank you for that. And I understand that. I understand the need for a strategy. What I don't understand is how we as Scrutiny can scrutinise it without that underlying information. So without seeing the service plans, without understanding the core strategy, without looking at whether or not we should outsource to another provider who then pays us, you know, rent for the building and a percentage of profits, etc. I've got no way of knowing. And I'm just hoping that this new strategy will actually take us forward, because I mean, I think I first asked about this 5 years ago, and since then we've gone backwards every year. And I appreciate there's been a pandemic in the middle. I'm not naive. I understand it's been considerable, and obviously we've got cost of inflation crisis, which has had a major impact on the school meal services. So I'm not ignoring all of that. What I'm looking for is to see that how do we come out of that? How do we turn this service round? How do we ensure it contributes effectively, both in terms of finance, but also in terms of the things that were mentioned earlier about the quality? I mean, we acknowledge the quality of the food that goes to schools and those sort of things. So don't get me wrong, this isn't all black and white and pennies, but we still need to understand it. So I for one, would welcome seeing those service plans, if it's possible to share them, to understand what timelines we're working to, when we're going to see profitability, and have we linked things. So, I mean, I went to, I think it was Beacon Hill a couple of months ago. Now, I would go there more often, quite frankly, but what stops me going to Beacon Hill Cafe is you have to pay £5 to park in the car park to use the cafe. So are we actually linking things together to make sure that if you went in the cafe, you could get a discount, for instance, on your car park? So are we being that radical that we're bringing these traded service up by thinking, as I said, outside the box?
Very happy to, after the session, go through the service plans and take you through this. That's absolutely more than happy to do that. What I would say, though, is that we do consider these things in the round, and our MI around these types of things has been improving over the recent years. So we do consider the impact of parking against the cafe, for example. We do consider in our recovery plans a full gamut of different types of operating models, different types of outsourcing models, even completely doing something very, very different. So when we've looked at Bow Manor, for example, we had a third party coming in and advising us on that, and we considered a large number of different options for that site. Sort of narrowed down on improving our wedding offerings and the high margin things like the winter fairs, the spring fairs, and those types of things, which have been very, very successful. School foods does have very significant challenges, as you're aware, but they are in line with the types of challenges our competitors are facing. And when you see the industry reports, we're in a very similar position that other organizations are in as well, and facing the same challenges in terms of commercial contracts, central government funding, and the financial pressures the schools are under. To Morgan.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think I'd probably sort of echo similar points to Mr. Richardson. I mean, certainly the report, yeah, there is the fact that we're focusing on what we're focusing on, and the fact that the strategy has come forward is obviously welcome. I mentioned earlier on to somebody, it always slightly unnerves me when the opening line to any report is actually referencing a Scrutiny Commission from 10 years ago, in the sense that it's taken 10 years to obviously develop a policy and get where we are. It's quite a significant period of time, but we are, as we discussed earlier on, you know, we are facing quite stark decisions about spending. You know, what resources we have to expend on services that we don't particularly want to stop, particularly the item that we discussed first today. And as a result, it does mean that we need to shine a spotlight on everything that this authority does, particularly those items that are discretionary. Pretty well everything, including school meals, but actually, I mean, I'd put school meals slightly to one side, but particularly on things like Bow Manor and some of the provision of parks and Century Theatre, etc., which are very much nice to haves. But we've already discussed one item today, which was more than a nice to have, where we're talking about ending the funding. So I think I'd probably back Councillor Mr. Richardson's proposal, which is to bring this item back in 6 months' time in more detail, because I think I'd formally suggest that I would second that, because I think it's particularly at this time where we are being asked to consider decisions or scrutinise decisions which are clearly not as we'd like to. I think Mr. Smith made the point earlier on, you know, nobody got elected to actually cut things, but we are having to make very, very hard decisions. And as a result, it's right that we spotlight and scrutinise in a lot of detail those items that inherently we know are probably costing us money as an authority to run, and are discretionary items to boot.
See, I was going to suggest that if members want to get in sort of detail in sort of 6 months, as Mr. Morgan suggests, whether we just sort of take one and report back focused on school food, because at the end of the day, that's the ones that dominate in the financial. It's kind of the trickier one to solve with these, and that's part of the difficulty with all these different services. So the answer to each one of them is different. So I wonder if you do want to get into a bit of the detail, actually focus on school food, and we'll bring something back 6 months' time, how we're getting on in terms of that recovery plan.
I think it probably, I mean, I appreciate school food is a significant item, and I mean, all of these items have been pulled together because traded services is obviously, but, you know, running Bow Manor is clearly not the same as providing school lunches, and running a theatre is clearly not the same as providing a cafe at Beacon Hill. But I think probably all of them, because my gut feeling would be that you know, several £100,000 of subsidy is probably going into each of these items one way or the other, to keep them operational, and I suspect that probably actually all of them. I mean, given that this morning's discussion was actually about cutting grants of 350,000 a year, that's probably a single budget item for any one of these traded services items. So, you know, if those are sort of choices that we're having to make, then I suspect it's more than just school meals that we need to really have a view about. Because, as Mr. Frisbee quite rightly stated, you know, when we're stopped in the supermarket and asked, you know, what are you doing about this? Actually, if we don't know, it's quite difficult.
school food takes up about 2/3 of the subsidy, which is why I sort of suggested that. Whereas the others, if you look at the tables, bottom of page 70, top of page 71, it gives you an idea what we were aiming for with sort of a budget set with COVID in mind versus actually what we did. So it is heavily skewed in terms of just that magnitude is by far the biggest one is the school food. But it's obviously up to scrutiny what comes back. It's just if you want the more focused it is, the more we can kind of get into the depth on it, as opposed to kind of being another, I suppose, a high level one if we have to pick up multiple services. But it's obviously up to scrutiny.
Richardson, did you want to?
I wasn't going to come back, but I'd just echo what Mr. Morgan said. I mean, I understand why you say school food because it's the biggest, but in some ways it's not the biggest, because something like Bow Manor Hall could bring a significant capital influx to this if we decided to get rid of it. Not saying we should, just saying if. And again, there are always hidden costs with places like this. So what is our long-term funding requirement to maintain that building, which must be colossal? What is our long-term funding requirement? So, what is the forward capital expenditure required on that site to maintain it? Because that doesn't form part of these figures. And therefore, these figures are skewed, I would argue, to a greater extent on those sites than they would be on school food, for instance, where it's a known on a yearly basis. Whereas where you've got a long-term commitment to a site of historic value and importance, there are costs there which we could suddenly incur that nobody dreamed of in a building like that. So I think Mr. Morgan is right. We do need to look at all of them. I mean, it may be perhaps the appropriate thing for this is to do some sort of workshop on it rather than take up a scrutiny commission meeting, but bring it back to scrutiny commission afterwards. But a workshop for the commission might enable us to delve into these and ask those questions and look at things which wouldn't be very interesting to the public, but also with a selection of spreadsheets, which we could do in that sort of environment. So I, for one, would be happy for it to come back to here, but to have a working group or something to look at it, as we've done recently on adults community, which was very successful in one aspect, which we could then bring back to the committee.
So it's a general consensus. We have a working panel to look at it, and then in 6 months' time, we bring it back again for discussion to the Scrutiny Commission. Yeah. Okay, that's the general consensus. Mrs.
Well, if I may, we have to work it through with the officers first, and then we let you know, because we'll have to work it through.
Yeah, we'll update members on that. Arranged it. Mrs. Pryor, I think you were next.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm looking at page 82, where it's talking about Bow Manor Hall, and one paragraph on page 82 says it had a good trading period with income outperforming the budget, etc., etc., etc. The paragraph after that says Bow Manor was hard hit and made a loss. So for the public reading that, it's sort of contradicting each other. I appreciate if we go into it, but and also in the loss of £177,000, that is including the repairs, maintenance, marketing and premise officers, which are held in other budgets. So are we saying that £250,000 hasn't been included in that loss because they're held in other budgets? Sorry, just to be simple.
The simple answer to this is we've been aiming to address comments from scrutiny in previous reports, which was that the Commission sought us to be more transparent, particularly over the split, and I think Mr. Richardson made this on a number of occasions, between income and the contribution or overall cost of services. So that's absolutely what we've aimed to do there within Bow Manor, and it's worth saying this last year has been a really good year for income in Bow Manor Hall, which last year was the thing, and over COVID was the element that particularly concerned us, was that understandably we'd seen a significant drying up of a lot of the conference income we'd seen there. But what this past year has borne out at Bow Manor is that the results of the changes we'd made pre-COVID have now finally kind of come to bear, if you like, with a significantly improved income position. However, that is not to to deny the fact that this last year was absolutely punishing for the service, particularly in terms of energy costs, and a building like Bow Manor, obviously being very energy intensive given its size and age, was particularly hard hit by that. And also a recognition of the other costs is that, again, a building of the complexity of Bow Manor, particularly relating to property costs, means that costs are in other budgets. And again, for a transparency point of view, we've wanted to put that in as a kind of full disclosure there. So absolutely, as you've surmised, that those are the correct figures.
So if other budgets are also seeing slippage or loss, or not meeting budgets, is that because of the costs they're bearing for Bow Manor? You see what I mean? So if I'm running, I don't know, the cleaning, but that's not included in, that's included in my cleaning budget for the council, not Bow Manor. So does that affect my budget because I'm bearing the cost of somewhere else?
I think it's fair to say that the costs here are the costs that other budgets will have seen this following this for the year in question. It's not that Bow Manor will have placed additional costs on those budgets above and beyond what was forecast, apart from in areas where we have seen substantial inflation, and that's included within this report. So I think, cleaning's an example where we won't have seen substantial additional costs in other budgets as a result of Bow Manor this year compared to what was budgeted. Mrs. Hack.
Thank you. I think it's real. I mean, it's really useful to see the information and support some kind of deeper conversation with some of this stuff. One of the things I'm interested in is what capacity do we have? We obviously talk about something like Bow Manor and identify that there's, these are the reasons why we've not done X and Y and Z, but what capacity is there to fill up the space? So, for example, loads of year 6 kids will have missed out during COVID on their residentials because those residentials didn't go ahead. Those kids have never had that catch-up residential. Is there an opportunity to go to Leicestershire schools and offer them that residential time if it's available? Because I mean, I know my year 8 has never had a residential opportunity. Now, obviously, there are other residential opportunities across the region that youngsters will go to, but it seems to me Bow Manor's right on the doorstep. There's been a massive increase of costs of getting kids to residentials. Is that an opportunity for us to sell that to Leicestershire schools? The other thing that's said in here in terms of the school meal service, and again, if we can go into greater detail at a later stage, it indicated we'd lost 2 major multi-academy trusts through a tender process. Do we have that as a risk? Have we got tender processes that are coming up? And what capacity does that leave behind? Because we've lost 2 major mats. What capacity, what availability do we have to go to other organisations, to other schools to say, this is what we've got available, and actually, how do we sell that services to multi-academy trusts? Because they can vote with their feet, but our hope is that the service quality is such they won't want to, but how we selling that services to a wider range of schools. Thank you.
I'll come in first, if I may. So on the point about Bow Manor, the team is actively following up with schools, especially those schools that haven't been able to do the residentials and so forth. What we're seeing with a lot of schools is that even the transport costs to Bow Manor are prohibitive. So there is a softening in position of those residential trips as a result, but the team is actively working. We have a very good view of who's been in the past, what the normal routine looks like, and we're actively working with those head teachers to try and get those kids back in, because we do think it's important, not only from a commercial perspective, but we think the offering is really, really good and valuable. And we've expanded the offering as well to make it more interesting with Vikings and other exciting things. In terms of the school food side, we do anticipate the business is going to be smaller. And we do anticipate that we will have a smaller business, but with a more consistent and more robust margin position. So a number of the schools that have run through this pandemic period have been running at a loss for us, and especially some of the MATs based on historic contracts and commercial arrangements. And some schools are making a decision for understandable reasons that they want to focus on the cheapest possible offering, not necessarily the most balanced offering, which does go against the ethos of what we're trying to do. Of course, we want something to be cost effective, cost efficient, but we do want to provide good meals for the schools. So we do anticipate it'll be smaller. And we want to ensure that the system can flex the staffing and then those types of things in our provisioning to allow for that to happen. But then going in, being as competitive as we can within the ethos of the county.
Mr. Poland.
Thank you. My question's really around the marketing of Bow Manor Hall specifically, really. But in terms of, obviously, we've talked about the additional costs, and a building of that age is going to have additional costs, has been talked about by my colleagues. But I think ultimately get to a point where you're going to go, either we have to look at the future of our ownership on that site, whether we continue to run it as is, whether we actually then contract it out to a third party that can run it and get a fee, because as Mr. Richardson says, or what we do with it. And if we're going to keep it in-house, to what extent do we really push it for not only in the wedding sector, as this document talks about, but also very much in the conference sector and other such uses? So I guess my question's in a few parts, really. To what extent do we have a budget for marketing it as a conference venue, and how widespread is that? And secondly, as a result of that, do we monitor whether the expenditure in marketing is then reflected in do we get that money back, or is it a net cost to us? And how do we project that over a period of a few years to understand that whether marketing is value for money? Is it a case that we can make this thing make money if we just push the right levers in the right places, or is it something that's always likely to be a net drain, net cost on our budget?
I'm happy to pick that up. I think this is something where potentially at a workshop it would be really helpful for members to kind of see some of the journey that Bow Manor's been on over the past year, with quite an extensive amount of third-party input into the site to work with us on how to make that site more effective and perform better financially. On the specific points, in terms of a budget for marketing, there is a budget for marketing within Bow Manor's costs, and that's listed within the paper. In terms of managing the efficacy of everything that we're doing and managing performance, again, that has significantly improved over the past 18 months at Bow Manor. And again, there will be there's now some really good management information that we can share in the appropriate setting to allow members to kind of see how that's working. Particularly, there's been some very, very effective in-house delivered events around the winter fair, the spring fair, and things like that. So some real signs of the direction of travel we're seeking to go in is working very effectively. As Declan alluded to earlier, we've been working with some consultants on expanding the wedding business, and again, from that we have monthly feedback from those consultants detailing the return on investment from the work we're doing with them. So there's an awful lot of that already in train, which I think will give them some reassurance over the direction of travel and what we're aiming to achieve.
Sorry to come back again, but it was just in light of some previous answers. I mean, what I've always tried to get to here, and I don't know how we get to it, is we have this silo mentality where we put different costs and different income in different pots. If I'm running traded services, I want a balance sheet that tells me what traded services is costing me. No business could run this with money in different pots. So can we, for once and for all, have either a joint meeting with the other scrutiny committees that run these individual bits, or can we actually see for once a balance sheet with all the income, all the expenditure, that somebody simple like me would understand? Because what we're saying here is Bow Manor alone is lost 350,000 this year if you add on the other costs. So unless you've got a spectacular increase in profit, you're never actually even going to get to a break-even point, particularly if those ancillary costs of building maintenance that increase as they probably will with a building like that. So unless we can see that path in that action plan of how do we actually even get to full cost recovery, we're never going to get anywhere. And this is what worries me, that we're looking at a little pot here, which is income, revenue. I appreciate, and it's great you've put the other information in, but when can we ever get to a situation where we see a balance sheet for traded services? Because I'm sure on some of the others, there are hidden costs. So Beacon Hill, I'm sure the costs of building it, the cost of depreciation isn't in those figures.
Does anyone want to make any final comments, Mr. Brecken? Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, officers. Again, I'm going to sort of reiterate what my colleague says to my right here. I don't even know what the assets are in the traded service. I couldn't even tell you what we're selling, how many market stalls we actually occupy, and it's slightly bewildering. I would request greater transparency and clarity on some of this. I'm a business owner myself. I certainly couldn't operate in like this silo mentality that my colleagues refer to. I just think on behalf of the electorate as well, we just want clarity and parity so that we can all understand and make head or tail of it. Because at the moment, it just seems to be a little bit everywhere. And that's just me speaking as a fella off the street. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, officers.
Thank you. And I do echo this. And Richard was just saying, we've been on a great journey. I love the idea of being on this great journey, but the great journey has got to have an outcome. You then mentioned we've employed consultants. Now there's another great cost. And, you know, we are asked as a council to make these hard decisions. And, you know, we keep getting this pushed down our throat all the time. The report, the first report, we had to make or support a hard decision, while here I'm going on a journey, and it doesn't square with me. And I think we need to go, as we said, forward, and officers will work it through. And I think we've did sort of mention that we would like a scrutiny member workshop for everybody rather, and we work it through, and where we look at all of these details and where we actually have the cost, and then we may have to make a hard decision, but we do have to look at it and focus on that. We can't just keep going on journeys. So, you know, but thank you for all the work you're doing.
I want to come back, Mr. President.
Yeah, just one final thing. Does the traded services part of County Council, does that include some of the disused or redundant areas of County Hall itself? When I joined as a member, there was some discussion that we were going to make better use of this footprint. This is a vast amount of publicly owned property here. And so I'm just wondering, but business incubation, organisations looking for places to actually operate from, would that come into that?
Yeah, I was going to say County Hall comes under, I mean, the Ways of Working scheme, Peter Bedford leads on that, and I think that covers this building as a campus and how we use it and how we maximise space and revenue. So that is available, and it may well have come to the relevant panel, commission, committee. If not, it could.
We've had a report, and it has come.
Okay. Mr. Bark.
Yeah, I think it's fairly obvious what the Scrutiny Commission wants. I mean, Bowman Hall's losing 350,000 a year. To overcome that loss is going to take, as Mr. Richardson said, a staggering increase in turnover. And similarly with other things like the Century Theatre. I mean, I think I'm sure there are great efforts going in, but given the financial situation we're in, we need to be absolutely clear that is it really losing 350 or is it losing 650? Are there other hidden costs that aren't there? And I think the point about Leicestershire trading services, you wouldn't continue to run a company year after year, and I believe Mr. Morgan referred to 10 years ago, and you think, what have we actually done over 10 years? I mean, this isn't a criticism. I think it is a realistic, it isn't, I think there's genuine concerns, and we need to get to the bottom of it.
Does any other members have any comments, questions, Ms. Scott? Your profit before COVID.
every year used to come here and it contributed enormously to the budget. The members opposite are saying, you know, it's a millstone and we shouldn't, you know, we should be looking seriously, whether I read you rightly, whether we continue, particularly Terry, with it at all. For many years, it made a contribution to the budget and it helped stave off some of the cuts. So the issue and the challenge for me is, like so many things, you know, that are affected by COVID, had to be shut down, pretty much. How do we get back to where we were? And, you know, earlier on, one of the officers said they got someone in from the private sector, the commercial sector, to have a look and see what can be done. And I think that's the sort of thing we need to be going. What I think we can't lose sight of is some of the organisations that we trade with are also going through very, very difficult times, particularly schools at the moment are under huge pressures on their budgets, and mentioned earlier about visits and so on. And this is why I wondered, particularly about Manor Hall, whether we could be looking to diversify more away from the things that we've done in the past, particularly reliant on school. But I mean, it's all a challenge, isn't it? But I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that the reason these services were set up in the first place, the reason we took this risk, is that there were opportunities there to trade with schools, trade with a range of organisations that needed these services, wanted to work with the council, and then made us a profit which went back into the budget and helped to stave off cuts. And that's where we want to get back to.
But Simon, if I may come back, that is what we can analyse if we have a members' workshop of this Scrutiny Commission. And I think that is all that is our the members here saying, that we look at everything and then analyse it to go forward, rather than, you know, looking at that journey. And I think it is a very good suggestion. And then we feed into that.
Just to pick up on Mr. Galton's comment that prior to the pandemic, Bow Manor was making a profit, which contributed to the budgets. Did that include the £250,000 that is in other budgets? I don't seem to.
But to come back, this is what we can identify if we have a workshop, can't we? And then we look at it all together, and then we look at that journey. And it is good for transparency.
Do any other members have any comments? Mr. Breckham?
Just to sum up, really, I take on board all the members' comments, but the officers in front of you here, and there are no illusions of what certainly the Cabinet and this Council expects for us to deliver. You can't run a traded service at a loss. Richard's fully aware of that. Jane's fully aware of that. There's a lot that goes on that doesn't come into public. It's commercially sensitive about how we run the organisation. The number of people employed in traded services across both this county and other areas are phenomenal. And I think that is all part of this. It's trying to look at it and make it into a profitable service. So I think it's quite fair. The COVID did affect many businesses, and I think that's still part of that recovery. But it will come back in reports, and I think members can be assured. Certainly, Bow Manor has been looked at very hard. We know this the sale value of Bow Manor. We've looked at other options for it, but at the moment we're trying to make it sort of wash its own face. And I think that is the task that Richard took on board, and that was, if you like, a 12-month overview of, okay, well, let's see what we can deliver, and that will come back to you in detail. So.
Thank you. And if I may come back through you, Chairman, I think we recognise it. And I don't think that anybody wanted to make a negative comment, but we've got to appreciate that scrutiny is your critical friend. And that is our job, to scrutinise what is there, to be transparent, and to make sure that we support the officers in their journey. And we can only do that if we don't rubber stamp everything, if we work together to do that journey and work to that outcome. And I think that is the best way forward.
So if the Scrutiny Commissioners go away and discuss with officers about setting up a special, basically all-member panel extraordinary meeting virtually of the committee to discuss this in the near future. Thank you to everyone who contributed to that item. Thank you, Richard, Declan, Jane, and Mr. Brecken, which moves us on to item 13, which is the corporate complaints and compliments 2022-2023, which is on page 101 of your agenda pack. Simon Parsons, the Customer Relations Manager, is here to present this item. So if I hand over to you, Simon, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So this is the first of three annual complaints reports, focusing on all the non-statutory complaints, essentially everything non-social care. The other two reports will go into the respective adult and communities and children and families overview and scrutiny committees later in the year. The report sets out a challenging year with a 28% increase in overall numbers of corporate complaints this year, and that kind of really follows a kind of 5-year trend of gradual increase, possibly more significant last year. That also filters through last year into a rise in complaints that escalated to the local government and social care ombudsman, with a more pronounced increase there. That's possibly due to the nature of the way those complaints work. Those that the ombudsman has their own queue of complaints, so to speak, at the intake area. So there tends to be a backlog of those being picked on. So probably why that's a bit more pronounced. We also saw during the year a greater uphold rate, so a greater area where fault was found, so up to 51% from 39% during the year before. That predominantly is down to one simple thing: that throughout a lot of the areas of the complaints, delay was the key area in there of just a real challenge in sort of managing demand, most predominantly in the in two services, special educational needs and school admissions through the year. So much narrower, much easier to kind of define those as clear findings of fault, where they both have clear statutory timescales around when decisions or outcomes should be reached, and some clear challenges in meeting those through the year. Again, response times, again linked to the volume increases, saw some challenges, particularly, as I say, the first time we've been able to really to report separately on the kind of second stage review stage, which was a request at last year's commission to be able to report on that. So reporting is that data's in there for the first time this year, just showing that some of those areas around that, and showing specific pressures on the kind of senior manager review stage. Again, a lot of that, if I'm honest, is impacted by SEN complaints, where the challenges have been around a lot of the outcome in terms of understandably resolutions require finding a place, and there's challenges around that. So it's been difficult to close those down quickly. So just to touch on really the report highlights, I guess 3 areas that I would flag as significant volume. School admissions came through as the largest, and a very narrow issue there. It's all about managing the kind of demand around midterm transfer requests. That's an area that hasn't featured prominently in complaints reports for a number of years. So something very specific going on there around that. And a lot of work is going on to kind of bring that area back to the kind of service it has been performing previously. A bit of a perfect storm of retention issues, a new system being introduced, and some of those challenges, and just general pressures on school places in a number of the parts of the county are behind some of that area. SEN's been a much more longer term challenge and has featured as kind of the highest area for the last couple of years, and that's again continued to rise. again, lots of work going on and regular reports going into Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny around. There's obviously a comprehensive programme which members will be aware of, the Transforming Send in Leicestershire programme, as well as the Accelerated Progress Plan, which has been signed off by the DfE. So lots of challenges there. Again, what's coming through in complaints is very much around managing those timescales, managing that demand coming through the system, which has a lot of challenges throughout, and a lot of moving parts to that, whether it be resource challenges, national problems around educational psychologists, for example, which is a statutory requirement, lots of challenges there around that resource, sufficiency of places, the demand for special schools is at an all-time high, and obviously challenges around putting those in place, and just the simple number of EHCPs in the system has increased dramatically from previous years. So those are the challenges coming through there. In terms of just touching on the decisions from the Ombudsman, I mentioned the growth increase that. There's knock-on impact of an increase in findings and maladministration this year. So that increased from around 10,000 to 40,000 last year. Predominantly, that's again all in the SEN space. So it's all about redress payments for periods where students were out of school with no alternative or an insufficient alternative education provision in place, tends to be where most of those redress payments are coming through from. Compliments still coming through, slightly down on previous years, but to add balance to the report and just to reassure, we are still picking up good levels of those areas across the services. And whilst the focus of this report isn't the statutory care, I've included the high level numbers for the Commission to be aware of. Adults presents as a fairly stable picture, with a marginal decrease on previous year, and children's social care slight increase, but not perhaps to the extent of in the corporate sector around that. I think that's the main things to pick up from the report, Chair, but I have a second question.
Thank you, Simon. Mrs. Page.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you for your report. As always, it is very comprehensive, and I always find that it is a really good basis for the Council, and as you always agree to find the mistake, the shortcomings, and then it's put through the system as a learning curve, trying to address that. And on that, I've got two questions. Now, one, it is the managing around the school places. If you can elaborate a little bit more for me, because I've had a couple of complaints because the children didn't get the school places, but an awful lot, it's also down to the parent not applying. And we are doing a great deal by letting them know. But I know that the people in my cases didn't apply early enough and then complained and think it is the county's fault. And I was wondering what we, in your opinion, can do a little bit more about getting that out and the marketing and whatever else. Now, in relation to page 103, there is on item 20, the Ombudsman invested 24 adult social care complaints and reached adverse finding in 9 instances. So maybe 9 instances isn't a great deal when you think of the whole workload and what the team is doing. But what concerns me when we're talking about all of these hard decisions we are making and the money we're having to save, that financial payments of nearly 16,000, are quite substantial. And if you can talk me a little bit more around it, is it the Ombudsman just dishing out to appease, or were there actually serious items that needed these financial awards? And I know you said compliments are down. Well, people are always ready to complain, but they're never ready to send in compliments. And I do actually get quite a few compliments. And then when I say, can you send them in? Oh, no, you tell them. So, you know, I have actually forwarded some, but, you know, I think that is not a big issue. But thank you again for your report. And if you could elaborate, greatly appreciate.
Thank you. Yes, so starting with the admissions one, yep, absolutely right that there have been challenges in terms of parents not necessarily certainly putting a catchment school in the top three, which then means, well, risks disappointment, risks appeals, and things like that. What I can advise during the year is actually there's a change of process gone in the latest round of admissions, which is to address that very issue around. So previously, they're automatically now offered next nearest school rather than having to then go through the process of fresh applications and all of that. So there are some clear changes there. There's lots more information and lots more very specific messages to parents throughout the application process around, please make sure you put a catchment school in. So there is lots of work going to try and really drive that kind of that message home, which is largely working. In terms of, is that a key factor in terms of the complaints that we've seen in the report? If I'm honest, it probably isn't, because this is the ones that we're seeing here are all very much focused less around the kind of requests for the kind of the regular round of admissions process, that perhaps that's more relevant and where those lists come out. These tend to be people moving in and out of the county wanting to change school, and it's simply about delay in us dealing with those. Where we do have wider challenges around, so some of that is simple resourcing issues within the team and delay in picking some of those up, and I know the team are working hard to add capacity and to deal with that better. There is also a significant factor, particularly pronounced in the Obi Wigston sort of Blaby area, where the schools are completely oversubscribed in pretty much all year groups, and it's a real challenge finding schools in those areas. And so some of that is a factor there around. The team are working really hard, but it's just taking a long time to place children in those areas because they're just all massively oversubscribed. So there's some of those going on. The other question was around the adult social care ombudsman complaints. What I can give assurances on around that 16,000 is about 11,000 of that was on one case. So the remainder are fairly low levels of fault. So typically more symbolic payments of distress payments, time and trouble payments. There was one case which was a public report case that we had last year that's been through the cabinet process, and there'll be more detail in going to adults and communities overview and scrutiny later in the year, but essentially one that was an unfortunate case where essentially in the COVID period where services were suspended, had to be because of it was day services and just couldn't be delivered through that period of time in COVID. But unfortunately they weren't, we missed going back and reviewing that when restrictions were eased, and there was a pronounced period of time with a gap in service provision, so a fairly costly redress payment for that one. But that gives reassurance that the majority is that one case. Actually, in comparison nationally, adult social care reflects very well against the general national averages. It's an area the Ombudsman tends to uphold a lot of complaints on, and actually we fare pretty well in that sphere against other authorities. I can give that reassurance.
Mrs. Hack.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, just following on from Rosita's point about admissions, I think it would be really useful to get information out to parents about what their catchment schools actually are. So in my division, Brockenhurst is a traditional school that they would have gone to as parents, but is now out of catchment. So they would feel more comfortable applying for that school because it's just where they went. So I think, we have to recognise that stable communities will naturally want to apply for the schools that they went to as kids. So maybe we need to do a bit of work around that. But also I did have significant numbers apply for a catchment school and get criticised for not applying for a catchment school when they quite clearly did. So I think maybe that needs to be looked at, and I can provide you with that information. My question though is around special educational needs, and it's something that I've been blabbling on for a long time about. I don't feel that we're over the precipice yet. Is there a point at which we feel it'll get better? On Friday, I saw a report that Leicestershire is languishing at the bottom of the league table in terms of EHCP approvals. You know, the 20-week legal process is done in about 50% of cases. In Leicestershire, it's not even 4%. So at what point do we get over that scenario? Because we start approving these in 20 weeks, you see a reduction in complaints. That, to me, seems to be the obvious route. So what work do you think needs to be done from a complaint point of view? And are you satisfied that the services are going to be able to rein that back in so you don't come back to scrutiny next year with exactly the same position? Thank you.
So I think the key sort of plan that's going on there is the accelerated progress plan, which is the department are working to, and that's forecasting significant improvements by the autumn around the compliance with statutory timescales, which are right at the heart of the vast majority of these complaints. I don't necessarily, I'm not across all of the detail of that report right now, but I understand there's regular updates on that going to Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny Committee. So I'm sure a progress update will be in the next one there around how they're doing. But my understanding, broadly speaking, is a whole range of, well, it's a whole system review, and there's a whole range of things that they're looking at to improve that compliance, and is tracking to significantly up that percentage that you talk about, which is very low at the moment. By autumn, I'm told that's broadly on track, but again, I haven't got the detail to necessarily validate that one way or the other here.
Thank you very much, Chair. Really, my questions around the compliments side of this. I think it's really good that we record that for balance, and it's always good to recognise when we do well as an organisation, as when individuals do well as well. So it follows on, was I think from what Mrs. Page said before. What's a compliment? If I email back to an officer and say, thank you very much, appreciate you getting that done for me, is that a compliment? Do I have to email their boss and put, this is a compliment? Do you see what I mean? To what extent do we, at what point is me thanking someone, and then at what point is it recorded as a compliment? And then, because if it's sort of relatively low level thank, it might be something someone gets and goes, oh, that's nice, and then files it. So I guess as a follow-on from that, to what extent do members of staff, generally speaking, understand that we do record this information, and it might be nice to feed it up? Because honestly, in my jobs in the past, I have occasionally, and it is only occasionally, received emails thanking me for the work I've done, and you sort of you might almost feel big-headed forwarding that on. Do you know what I mean? So, but again, if you know that it's something that is recorded corporately and is important for the organisation to record on that level, you might be more inclined to do it. So I was just curious to get more info on that, please.
Yeah, sure. So we give broad advice out to departments around this, and the first one is that it needs to be unsolicited. So we don't pick up the ones where we're actively doing survey messaging or survey campaigns and things like that. So we exclude all of those, and thereafter it's very much around with the guidance we give. It needs to be a little bit more than a just kind of thanks for sorting that or thanks for processing that. We're looking for a little bit more rich compliment than those sort of things. But if it kind of really, if there's more detail behind it, we always say refer them on, because chances are we will record those. It's about, in terms of that mix of the 211 compliments, it's about a 50-50% mix between ones that are the members of the public kind of submitting them directly to our team, usually through the online form as a kind of compliment through the website, and ones that are referred in from staff members from at a variety of levels that are being picked up. So I'm sure there's more out there that aren't reaching us. Absolutely, that's the nature of the beast, and I'm sure there are plenty or more satisfied residents that don't come forward and make those in the first place. So it's always a challenge picking those up. But but it's pleasing to see it's been relatively consistent levels despite the challenges going on, and that's still relatively consistent around the sort of 200 mark for the last couple of years that we've been picking through, which is nice to see. Like I say, there's always, I'm sure, more out there we could do work with, but yes, we do issue that guidance, which I hope answers that.
Thank you, Chair. Just a quickie, really. We say that 15% of complaints weren't handled within the 40-day period, which equates, if my maths is correct, to about 110 complaints out of the 781 in the last year. Now, I have a vague recollection that last year we did actually ask that this report contained details of the longest one, which I didn't notice from this one. I could be mistaken on that one, but I thought we had asked to say how long did the longest one take and why. But take that to one side. Of the 110, do we know how they were predominantly designated as delays? Now, logic would say it's either in school admissions or SEN, but do we know what the split is of those 110 that went over the 40 days, of what type of area the complaint was in?
Yes, that data will be all available and potentially could be provided if that would be useful. The vast majority of them, I can say, will be in the SEN area rather than the school admissions. School admissions ones, although high volume, actually were turned around very quickly when they came into the formal complaints territory. We had very good links with senior managers in admissions to get on top of them when they did go into the formal complaints territory. The issue was more around getting on top of the workloads. Before that, SEM much more of a challenge getting them responded to from that area. But and apologies if I did miss that from last time. But yeah, that equally could be provided if that would be helpful to members. That data's all there. Yes.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the report. As Chair of Children and Families Overview and Scrutiny, you may be reassured that we scrutinise all of this, and there is our next meeting is in September, and I think I'm almost guaranteed there will be some very good, positive, forward-looking that hopefully we should not see a report like this again. There is a shortage of specialised staff outside the council to help with the plans and things, child psychologists, care, etc., etc. I'm not making excuses, but I can honestly guarantee to this committee that the staff in children and families are working there as hard as they possibly can to rectify this. And there are new exciting things coming forward, and it has been a big review. Probably this was the department in many ways that was, because of the very nature of dealing with children and families, that the pandemic impacted on, and I don't mean operationally here in the department, but with the children and young people coming forward now who are still being affected by the previous 3 years, the lack of schooling, supporting of families. We did our best, but I know in my own village there were children who didn't go to school and have been massively affected because during that time, and I won't mention names or anything, 2 young people very near me in the village, and their father died during the pandemic, not of COVID, but he was nursed at home so that the family could see him. Now, those children are still trying to overcome that, and they have been in touch with here at County Hall, and they are getting the support. But this is a knock-on effect, and I have said this in the meetings of children and families. We'll still be seeing some of this outcomes that will probably move into adults and communities within the next 5 years. This is children and families. It will move. We don't know. It's uncharted ground. But I just wanted to reassure everybody we are doing our very best. And I would hope that when we have our meeting on the 5th of September, the papers will come out a week before. I would like to advise everybody to read those and see what's happening. Okay, thank you very much, Chair.
Okay. Anyone want to Back on Mrs. Fry's comments. No. Any other members of the committee have any other questions, comments to make? Oh, okay, well, thank you very much, Simon, for the detailed report and for answering everyone's questions. Which moves us on to item 14, which is the Overview and Scrutiny Annual Report 2022-23. A copy of the draft annual report is attached to the agenda starting at page 129. The report is backward-looking and outlines the key work undertaken over the last 12 months by the Commission and the 5 other standing Overview and Scrutiny Commissions. The committees have been given the chairs and spokespersons of all commissions have been given the opportunity to comment on the draft, which is now attached. Subject to approval, the annual report will be submitted to the full County Council for consideration at its meeting in July. Mr. Morgan.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I ask for one amendment on page 2 of the report on the contents page? The Health Committee has been left off. So as a scrutiny, and unless somebody wants to tell me something about the work of the Health Scrutiny Committee, but we are missing from the contents page. We are actually in the report and it's all absolutely fine, but just the contents page. Thank you.
We can make that amendment. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. Does any other members of the committee have any comments on the report? Mr. Richardson.
Just quickly, Mr. Chairman, just to say I think it's really good news, the number of views on the webcast. I mean, 9,700 struck me as something impressive, and I can't remember what it was the previous years, but I'm sure it's up quite considerably and clearly going in the right direction with public involvement. So I just wanted to highlight as well. I thought it was good news.
Yes, it is. And thank you to everyone who put together the report. It's put together in a very, I think, accessible way. I think most members of the public would find it very easy and readable and approachable report to go through and broken down in quite a manageable fashion. Does anyone else on the committee have any comments to make on the report? No, so just say thank you to all the officers who put it together, and therefore, do we take the report as agreed with the amendment Mr. Morgan mentioned? Okay, Mrs. Page.
How do we circulate it, just so it is on record, how it can be accessed and circulated for the wider public? And thank you to all the officers again.
We circulated first with papers for the council meeting in July and published on the website, and then usually we have a section in Leicestershire Matters that flags it, and it is put on the website indefinitely.
But it will be on Leicestershire Matters with a link. Thank you.
So if there's no further comments, we take it's agreed, which moves on to item 15, which is dates of future meetings. The dates of the meetings of the 2023-24 Scrutiny Commission have been scheduled to take place on the dates that are listed on your agenda. Can we take those as agreed? Okay, and item 16, as stated at the start of the meeting, there's no urgent items, so I declare the meeting closed, and thank you to everyone for your contributions today.